Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are doing something a little different. Usually we take a topic, we circle it, we poke at it from a few different angles. But today we are going straight into the machinery. We're tackling a subject that I think everyone feels like they understand, but maybe almost nobody actually does.
Yeah, and we're not talking about the surface level stuff. We're
Yeah.
not talking about, I lost my keys again, or, oh, look, a squirrel.
No, we are officially banning the word squirrel from this deep dive.
Agreed.
We are looking at the hard science,
Yeah.
the neurobiology. I have a stack of papers here that is, honestly, it's a little terrifying. We're looking at research spanning from, 2010 all the way to a brand new study from 2026.
It's a huge range. We've got major reviews from Nature. We have papers out of translational psychiatry. We're pulling from work done at King's College London, at Yale.
It's a massive stack.
It is, but it's necessary because the popular narrative around ADHD, the stuff you see on social media, it's all about behavior.
Right. You fidget, therefore you have ADHD.
Exactly. But the scientific narrative, the actual research, has moved so far beyond that. It's not about what you do. It's about why your brain does it.
That's the thing that struck me most reading through all this. We were moving from this idea of ADHD as a behavior problem to ADHD is a distinct, visible neurobiological condition.
That's the core mission for this hour.
Yeah.
We want to bridge that gap for you. We want to take you from that old, frankly outdated idea of a chemical imbalance, which is a massive oversimplification.
At best, yeah.
At best, and move you to the modern understanding. We're going to get into the triple network model, the maturational delay hypothesis, and really the specific architecture of the ADHD brain.
Okay, so let's set the stage a bit. We're covering some foundational work by people like Dr. Katja Rivia, Dr. Amy Ornstein, and we're going to end on this really mind-bending 2025 paper on machine learning subtypes. But I want to start with the hardware, the most basic question. If I put my brain in an MRI scanner and then I put a neurotypical brain in there, are they actually physically different, or is this all just a software glitch?
Oh, it is absolutely a hardware difference. But, and this is a really important but, where we have to be careful, it's not damage.
Okay.
It's a difference in trajectory.
Yeah.
A difference in development. And to understand that, we really have to talk about the maturation lag hypothesis.
Lag. Okay, that word itself implies a delay.
Precisely. This is one of the most robust, most replicated findings in the entire field. And if we look at the 2018 review by Dr. Katja Rivia in Frontiers in Human Neuroscience, and then we jump forward to the massive 2024 ADHD primer by Dr. Stephen Farrone in Nature, they both zero in on something called cortical thickness.
Okay, cortical thickness. I know the cortex is that outer wrinkly layer of the brain, the gray matter.
Right. It's the executive suite. It's where all the heavy lifting happens. Your thinking, your planning, your perception. Now, in a developing child's brain, the cortex doesn't just get thicker and thicker until you're an adult.
I would have assumed it does.
It's a common misconception. It actually follows a parabolic curve. It gets thicker as you're a kid, as you're learning and building all these new connections, and then it reaches a peak density. After that peak, it starts to thin out.
Thinning out sounds bad.
It's actually essential. It's a process called synaptic pruning. The brain is literally cutting away the noise, the useless connections, to make the whole system more efficient.
It's like sculpting.
That is the perfect analogy.
Yeah.
You start with this big block of marble, and then you have to chip away everything that isn't the statue. That thinning is the sculpting. It's creating a masterpiece.
Okay, so there's a peak moment, this point of maximum density, before the important sculpting begins.
Exactly. Now, here's the kicker. In neurotypical kids, that peak happens at a very specific age, depending on the brain region. But in kids with ADHD, that peak is delayed.
Delayed? How delayed? Like by a few months?
No, we're talking about a delay of approximately 2 to 5 years.
Wait, say that again?
2 to 5 years.
That's a huge number. So let me just try to process that. If I have a 10-year-old son and he's struggling in school, he's impulsive. You're saying that parts of his brain might biologically look like they belong to a 5-year-old or a 7-year-old.
In specific regions, yes. And I want to be really precise here because this is where parents and frankly adults with ADHD can often spiral into shame or worry.
Right.
We are not talking about the whole brain. We are absolutely not talking about intelligence. A 10-year-old with ADHD typically has the vocabulary and reasoning skills of a 10-year-old. Their math aptitude, their visual cortex, their sensory and motor cortices, they're often mature right on schedule.
So they aren't behind in terms of being smart.
Not at all. That's a critical distinction.
Yeah.
But the delay, the lag, is highly specific to the frontal lobes, the superior temporal regions and the parietal regions.
Which are the parts of the brain responsible for
Executive function.
the management system.
The CEO. Planning, impulse control, working memory, emotional regulation. It leads to this incredibly painful mismatch. Imagine you have a Ferrari engine. That's the raw intelligence. But it's sitting inside a car chassis that has the braking system of a bicycle.
The engine is powerful.
Incredibly powerful. But the brakes just haven't been built and installed yet.
Well, honestly, that's heartbreaking because society, parents, teachers, we treat them like the Ferrari. We look at a smart kid and we say, you know better. Why did you just interrupt the teacher for the 5th time? Why did you hit your sister?
Exactly. We judge the performance of the brakes based on the horsepower of the engine. But the frontal cortex, the very part of the brain that says, hey, wait, hitting your sister's a bad idea, is biologically operating on a significant delay.
You would never expect a 5-year-old to have perfect diplomatic skills or impulse control.
Of course not. But we expect it of the ADHD 10-year-old because they look 10 and they talk like they're 10. They have the intelligence of a 10-year-old. The mismatch is the source of so much pain and misunderstanding.
Does this delay apply to the wiring too? I mean, the connections between these areas? Or is it just the gray matter itself?
It's the wiring too. The cables, what we call the white matter tracks, that connect the prefrontal cortex to the rest of the brain, particularly the striatum and cerebellum, show delayed myelination.
Myelination is the insulation on the wire, right?
It's the insulation. It's what makes the signals move fast and efficiently. So not only is the processor, the CEO, biologically younger, but the internet connection to the rest of the company is slower and has more static.
So the obvious million-dollar question here is, does it ever catch up? Or is the ADHD brain sort of permanently 5 years behind schedule?
That's the question researchers have been chasing for decades. And Pheromone's 2024 review in Nature gives us a really nuanced and I think hopeful answer.
Okay.
In many cases, yes, parts of it do catch up. They found that the volume of a structure called the caudate nucleus, which is a key part of the basal ganglia involved in goal-directed action and habit formation, often normalizes as the person moves into adulthood.
Normalizes. So it eventually reaches the same size and density as a neurotypical brain.
Correct. And this tracks perfectly with what we see in the real world, clinically.
Yeah.
A lot of kids grow out of the extreme hyperactivity.
They stop climbing the furniture.
They stop climbing the furniture. Their motor circuits mature. They get less fidgety.
Yeah.
The caudate is caught up.
And I'm speaking from, let's say, personal observation here. A lot of adults don't grow out of the rest of it. The inattention, the disorganization.
Right, and that's the nuance. While some regions like the caudate may normalize, others may retain a distinct architecture permanently. Or, perhaps more commonly, the brain develops compensatory networks.
Workarounds.
Exactly. The brain is incredibly plastic. It finds back roads. So you might stop being physically hyperactive, but that internal restlessness, that brain buzz, remains because the core attentional networks are still operating differently.
Okay, so that's the hardware. The sculpture is finished a little later, or maybe some parts are finished a little differently. But let's talk about the software. Because even if the brain eventually looks normal in size, it doesn't seem to run the same way. This is where we get into the network theory, right?
The triple network model.
Yeah.
This is, in my opinion, the single most important conceptual shift in our understanding of ADHD in the last decade. It changes everything.
And this is based on the 2020 Pereira, Sanchez, and Castellanos paper, and also the Sanugabark review from 2022.
Yes, among others. For a very long time, we looked at the brain in terms of blobs on a scan. We'd say, oh, this blob in the frontal lobe lights up when you focus. But the brain doesn't operate in isolated blobs. It operates in vast, interconnected, large-scale networks.
Like different operating systems running on the same computer?
That's a good way to think about it. And for ADHD, there are 3 really big ones you absolutely need to know.
Okay, walk us through them.
First, you have the default mode network, the DMN.
I have heard of this one. This is the daydreaming network, right?
It's often called that, but I feel like that sells it short. The DMN is really the me network.
The me network.
Yes. It's active when you are resting, sure. But it's also active when you are thinking about your past, planning your future, considering what other people think of you, or reflecting on your own identity. It is essentially your internal monologue, your sense of self over time.
Okay. So channel 1 is the me channel. What's next?
Next, you have the central executive network. It's also called the frontoparietal network, or FPN. This is the task network. This is the OS that boots up when you need to solve a math problem, write a complex email, or navigate through heavy traffic. It's goal-directed. It looks outward at the world.
Got it. The work channel.
Right. Now, here is the crucial part. In a neurotypical brain, these two networks are what we call anti-correlated.
Anti-correlated.
Think of a seesaw. When the work channel goes up, the me channel has to go down.
They can't both be high at the same time.
They cannot. It's a fundamental principle of efficient brain function. If you need to focus on a spreadsheet, the brain actively suppresses the default mode network. Your internal monologue gets quiet so you can process the external data.
That sounds remarkably peaceful.
It is incredibly efficient. It allows for focused, deep work. But in the ADHD brain, the seesaw is broken.
Broken how? It's stuck.
This is what's known as the interference hypothesis. In ADHD, when the task network trying to turn on to deal with that spreadsheet, the default mode network failed to turn off.
It just stays online.
It stays online, or it flickers on and off wildly. It intrudes. It crashes the party.
Hang on, so you're sitting there, you're trying to look at the numbers on the screen, but the me channel is still broadcasting at full volume in your head.
Precisely. You are trying to work, but your brain is simultaneously playing a highlight reel of an embarrassing thing you said 3 years ago, or wondering what you should have for dinner tonight, or suddenly noticing that the tag on your shirt is incredibly itchy.
This explains the brain noise, the constant internal static that people with ADHD talk about. It's not a metaphor.
It's not a metaphor at all. It is literally two massive, energy-hungry brain networks fighting for dominance at the same time. And think about the energy cost of that.
I was just about to ask. That must be exhausting.
It is profoundly metabolically expensive. You are burning through glucose just to fight your own brain's tendency to self-distract. This is why people with ADHD often report such deep, bone-weary exhaustion after doing simple cognitive tasks like paying bills or answering emails. Their brain is working double time just to maintain the signal amidst all the noise.
So if the seesaw is broken, where is the referee? What's supposed to fix the seesaw?
That's the third network, the salience network. Its job is to be the switch.
A switch.
Yes. Its primary hubs are the anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula. It constantly monitors your internal and external environment, and its job is to decide what is salient, what's important right now, and then toggle control between the DMN and the task network.
And in ADHD, I'm guessing.
Yes. The switch is glitchy. Specifically, a key hub of the salience network, the right anterior insula, is often found to be underactive or even structurally thinner. It fails to send that strong, clear, stop broadcasting a signal to the default mode network when it's time to work.
Okay, so let me try to summarize the triple network model, just to make sure I've got it. It's not that I can't focus, it's that my brain's automatic switch is weak, so my me channel keeps interrupting the work channel, creating this constant internal noise and making me exhausted.
That is the perfect summary. And what's so powerful is that Farron's 2024 paper notes that this reduced anti-correlation, this failure of the seesaw, is one of the most robust replicable findings in the entire field of ADHD neuroimaging. It appears again and again across thousands of subjects. It's real.
I want to pivot now to the chemistry, because if the networks are the software, the neurotransmitters have to be the electricity powering it all. And this is where we always hear the classic line, it's a dopamine deficit. Is that true, or is that another one of those oversimplifications?
It is partially true, but it misses the beautiful complexity of the mechanism. For this, we absolutely have to look at the foundational work of Dr. Amy Arnsten from Yale. Her papers from around 2010 and 2011 are just canonical in this field. She talks about the prefrontal cortex, the PFC, as being a Goldilocks organ.
Goldilocks, as in it needs things to be just right.
Exactly. The PFC is the CEO of the brain. It's the most evolutionarily advanced part of us. But it is chemically very, very fragile. It requires an absolute optimal chemical environment of two key neurotransmitters to function properly, norepinephrine and dopamine.
And Arnsten has this famous way of describing it, the inverted U curve.
Yes, the inverted U. I think this is one of the most helpful concepts for anyone to understand. Imagine a graph that looks like an upside-down letter U. On the horizontal axis, the bottom axis, you have arousal or neurotransmitter levels.
Okay.
And on the vertical axis, going up the side, you have PFC, performance, how well you can think and focus. On the far left of that curve, you have very low arousal, you're drowsy, you're bored, you're fatigued. There isn't enough chemical fuel, not enough norepinephrine or dopamine. So your PFC is basically offline. It's sluggish.
And on the far right of the curve?
On the far right, you have extremely high arousal. This is the stress zone. Panic, terror, extreme anxiety. In this state, the brain gets flooded with too much dopamine and norepinephrine. And this is key. That flood of chemicals essentially disconnects the PFC. It shorts it out.
It shuts down. Why?
So your more primitive brain, the amygdala, the fight or flight center, can take over. You don't want your thoughtful CEO making a 5-point plan when there's a bear chasing you. You want your primal brain to just run.
So the PFC, or advanced thinking brain, stops working if it's too bored or if it's too stressed.
Precisely. The sweet spot, the peak performance, is right at the very top of that U-curve. You need to be alert, but calm.
Well,
Interested, but not panicked. That's the optimal zone.
and the ADHD brain, naturally, without any intervention, sits where on this curve?
Typically, it sits on the left-hand slope, the under-aroused state. The tonic firing, the baseline level of dopamine and norepinephrine signaling in the PFC is too low. The PFC is chronically underfueled and sluggish.
Ah, and this explains the stimulant paradox, right? The thing that confuses everyone. If I give a normal person a stimulant like speed, they get jittery and unfocused.
Exactly. If you take a neurotypical person who is already sitting comfortably at the top of that curve and you give them a stimulant, you push them right off the cliff into the stress zone on the right. Their PFC starts to shut down. They get scattered, anxious, and cognitively rigid.
But for the ADHD brain,
You're just pushing them up the hill. You're taking them from the under-aroused left side and moving them toward the optimal peak at the top.
Ornstein goes even deeper than just the levels, though. She talks about the specific roles of these two chemicals in terms of signal and noise. This was the part of her paper that really made it all click for me.
It is absolutely brilliant work. She explains the specific receptors involved. So norepinephrine primarily acts on something called the alpha-2A receptor in the PFC. When this receptor is stimulated, it increases the signal.
What does that mean, increases the signal?
It strengthens the connections between the neurons that are relevant to the task you are doing right now. It makes the important information louder in your brain.
So norepinephrine is like turning up the volume knob for the music you actually want to hear.
Perfect, yes. Now, dopamine primarily acts on the D1 receptor, and its job is to decrease the noise.
The static.
The static. It dampens the random, irrelevant firing of all the other neurons that aren't related to your task. It quiets the distractions.
So it's like putting on noise-canceling headphones.
That is the best analogy there is.
Yeah.
To function optimally, your PFC needs norepinephrine to boost the signal, turn up the music, and it needs dopamine to cut the noise put on the headphones. In ADHD, you have a genetically driven situation where you have a weak signal and very loud static. The reception is just terrible.
So when we take a stimulant medication,
At a therapeutic dose, you are artificially tuning the radio, you are boosting the alpha-2A activity to lock onto the signal, and you are boosting the D1 activity to mute the distraction. You're creating that optimal chemical environment that allows the PFC to come online and do its job.
but there's a catch with stress, isn't there? Because I know from experience, and I've heard this from so many people, that I can focus when I'm terrified. If a deadline is 1 hour away, I suddenly have laser focus. How does that fit the model?
That's the panic monster saving you. It's a different and much more costly mechanism. When you are under extreme stress and pressure, your adrenal system is dumping massive amounts of catecholamines, norepinephrine, and dopamine into your entire brain.
So I'm getting that chemical boost.
You are. You might briefly shoot past the optimal point at the top of the curve on your way to the too stressed side, but for a short time, you're in the zone. The problem is that relying on adrenaline to focus is incredibly toxic for your body. It's corrosive. It burns you out.
Yeah, that sounds painfully familiar. I can't possibly write this paper until the night before it's due. You're essentially using terror as a medication for your brain.
You are self-medicating with endogenous adrenaline from your own body because your baseline dopamine wasn't enough to get the engine started on its own. It's a very common and very damaging coping mechanism.
I want to talk about something else that is just incredibly validating in this research, time blindness. Because we call the condition attention deficit, but honestly, for a lot of people, the time deficit feels just as profound, if not more so. Is there a biological basis for why I am perpetually, say, 5 minutes late to everything?
There absolutely is, and it's a fascinating story because it involves a part of the brain we used to almost completely ignore in ADHD research.
The cerebellum.
The cerebellum. That's the little brain at the very back of the head,
Right.
under the main cortex. I thought that was just for balance and motor coordination, like helping me not fall over when I walk. That's what we were all taught in high school biology. And it's true, it does that. But modern neuroscience, and specifically the series of meta-analyses done by Dr. Rubia's team, spanning from around 2012 up to 2023, has shown that the cerebellum is so much more. It's one of the brain's primary internal clocks.
Or internal clock.
Yes, it's a temporal predictor. It helps you predict timing on the scale of milliseconds, like when to swing a bat to hit a baseball, and on the scale of seconds and minutes, like estimating how long a task is actually going to take. It keeps the beat.
It's the brain's metronome.
It is. And in ADHD,
Let me guess. It's underactive.
consistently underactive and, crucially, functionally disconnected from the frontal lobes, specifically during timing tasks. The communication link is weak.
So my internal clock is literally broken, or at least running slow.
It's not just the clock either. Rubia's work makes a really important distinction between inhibition, which is about stopping yourself from making an impulsive response, and timing. They are two separate skills handled by different circuits.
Okay, what's the difference?
Inhibition, the brake pedal, relies heavily on the right inferior frontal cortex. But timing time estimation, temporal foresight, relies on a different network. The left inferior frontal cortex, parts of the parietal lobe, and the cerebellum.
Why does that distinction matter so much?
Because it means time blindness is a distinct cognitive deficit. It's not just a side effect of being distracted and losing track of time. It is a fundamental impairment in your brain's ability to perceive the passage of time accurately.
That hits hard, because I think anyone with this experience has been called selfish or disrespectful or lazy for being late their whole life. People assume you just don't care enough about their time to be punctual.
And that is the absolute tragedy of it.
Yeah.
It's an invisible disability. If you were visually blind, nobody would get mad at you for bumping into a table. They would understand. But time blindness is completely invisible.
Yeah.
So when you say, okay, I'll be there in 5 minutes, you aren't lying. In your brain, it genuinely feels like the task will only take 5 minutes, but your internal metronome is skipping beats. Your estimate is off. It's actually going to take 20 minutes.
And no amount of trying harder or willpower is going to fix a dysfunctional cerebellum circuit.
No, absolutely not. You need prosthetics. You need external tools. You need visible clocks everywhere, timers, alarms, phone alerts. You have to outsource the timing function to your environment because the internal hardware is unreliable.
Let's move to the real cutting edge now, because this is where it gets wild. I want to talk about this 2025 paper from Translational Psychiatry by Chen and a team of colleagues. Because up until this point in our conversation, we've been talking about the ADHD brain as if it's one single thing.
Right. And clinically, that's still largely how we treat it. You walk into a doctor's office, you get a diagnosis of ADHD, and you almost certainly get prescribed stimulant. Maybe they specify if you're inattentive or hyperactive, but the first-line treatment is largely the same for everyone.
But the biology, the actual brain scans, they don't support that simplicity, do they?
Not anymore. This Chen paper is, I think, a true game changer. They used a really advanced technique called semi-supervised machine learning on a large data set of structural MRI scans from adolescents.
Okay, semi-supervised machine learning. Can you put that in plain English for us?
Sure. Basically, instead of taking all the brain scans and telling the computer, okay, this group has ADHD and this group doesn't, now find the differences. They did something smarter. They just fed the computer algorithm hundreds and hundreds of brain scans and let the computer find the natural patterns itself. They let the math tell them how the brains group together without human bias.
And the computer didn't just find two groups, ADHD and not ADHD.
No. That's what's so revolutionary. Within the ADHD cohort, it found 3 distinct, statistically significant biological subtypes. And this is the real kicker. These 3 biological subtypes do not neatly map onto the clinical labels of inattentive or hyperactive that we use today.
So the way doctors diagnose it doesn't match the underlying biology.
It seems not. The biology is more complex.
So what did the computer find? What are the 3 types?
Subtype 1 was characterized by what they called an underdeveloped dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or DLPFC.
The DLPFC, that's the core executive function center, right?
The absolute heart of it. In this group, the cortex in that critical area was significantly thinner than in the neurotypical controls. This looks exactly like the classic maturation delay hypothesis we talked about at the beginning. This is the brain that's behind schedule.
Okay, that makes sense. What was subtype 2?
Subtype 2 was a mixed subtype. It showed some thinning in certain parietal regions, but it actually had increased gray matter volume in other areas. It was a much patchier, more complex profile of differences.
And subtype 3?
This is the really weird one, the one that turns everything on its head. Subtype 3 was what they call the overdeveloped subtype. In this group, the cortex was actually, on average, thicker than the neurotypical control group in several key regions.
Wait a second. Thicker? But I thought we spent the whole first section establishing that ADHD is caused by a delay, by things being thinner and developing more slowly. How could it be thicker?
This completely challenges that simple narrative. Remember how we talked about pruning? How the brain needs to thin out in adolescence to become efficient?
Right, the sculpting process.
It is possible, and this is still speculation, but it's very grounded speculation, that this overdeveloped subtype represents a fundamental failure of pruning. The brain didn't cut away the noise. It didn't sculpt the statue. It's too dense. It's overgrown with connections.
So instead of a well-tended garden, you have a dense, overgrown jumble.
Exactly. And you can see how both a barren desert and an overgrown jungle would make it incredibly difficult to get from point A to point B.
Yeah.
The functional outcome is the same, executive dysfunction, but the underlying biological cause could be the complete opposite. You can have ADHD symptoms from a brain that is underdeveloped or from a brain that is overconnected and underpruned.
So why does this matter for the person listening right now who's dealing with ADHD? What's the practical implication?
It comes down to how they responded to medication. This is the crucial part of the study. They found that standard stimulant medication worked significantly better for subtype 1 and subtype 2, the two groups that had some element of underdevelopment.
Okay.
But it worked much less well for subtype 3, the overdeveloped group.
Wow. So if I'm a type 3 and I go to a doctor and I get put on Ritalin and it doesn't work or it makes me feel awful, I might just conclude, well, I guess I don't really have ADHD, but in reality, I might just have a different kind of ADHD that requires a totally different treatment.
That is precisely the implication. This is the dawn of personalized biological psychiatry. Right now, we are essentially throwing darts in the dark. Try this pill. Oh, that made you anxious. Okay, let's try this one. In 10 or 15 years, we might be able to do a quick brain scan, see that you have a type 3 brain, and know immediately that you need a non-stimulant medication or maybe a therapy focused on cognitive training or something we haven't even invented yet.
That is incredibly hopeful, but it also leads us to the elephant in the room, the medication itself. There is so much fear and stigma, especially from parents, that giving these powerful stimulant drugs to a developing brain is inherently bad, that it causes damage, that it will rot the brain over time.
That is a pervasive and very damaging myth. And to dismantle it, we need to go back and look at the data from Rubia's 2014 paper and Farahoni's 2024 review, because they both look specifically at this question of long-term effects and neuroplasticity.
Neuroplasticity being the brain's ability to change and rewire itself based on experience.
Yes. They did a type of study called a meta-regression analysis. They gathered all the existing studies and compared two groups of ADHD patients. Those who had never taken medication, the medication-naive group, versus those who had been on long-term medication for years.
And what did they find?
Well, if the medication damages the brain theory were true, you would expect the long-term medicated group to look worse on their brain scans.
Right. They should have more thinning, more atrophy, more dysfunction.
But the data showed the complete opposite. They found what they call a normalization effect.
Normalization.
Yes. For example, in the medication-naive patients, that critical right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex was consistently offline. It was underactivated during tasks. But in the long-term medicated patients, that same region showed normal levels of activation. It looked, functionally, like a neurotypical brain.
So the medication didn't just treat the symptoms in the moment. It actually helped the brain fix itself over time.
It suggests that, for many people, the medication may be neuroprotective.
Neuroprotective. That is a massive, massive word.
It is. Think about it this way. If you have a badly broken leg and you just keep walking on it without a cast, the bone is going to heal crooked. You'll end up with a permanent limp, permanent damage. The cast itself doesn't heal the leg. Your body does that. But the cast holds the bone in the correct position so that it can heal properly.
And the stimulant is the cast for the brain.
It's a fantastic analogy. By boosting the norepinephrine and dopamine, by fixing that Goldilocks chemical environment, the medication allows the brain's networks to fire together in the correct, efficient pattern. And the fundamental rule of neuroplasticity is neurons that fire together wire together.
So if you allow the brain to practice focusing correctly over and over, it starts to build the permanent structure to support that focus.
That's the idea. So by denying medication out of fear, we might actually be denying the developing brain the very scaffolding it needs to mature correctly and avoid long-term deficits.
The evidence Farron cites even points to structural changes, right?
Yes. He notes that methylphenidate, for instance, is associated with preserving cortical thickness in some frontal areas and normalizing the volume loss often seen in a structure called the putamen. It seems to help the brain stay on, or get back to, a more typical developmental trajectory.
That is a complete and total reversal of the stigma.
It is. And it's so important because it changes the conversation from, Are we drugging our children? To are we treating a neurodevelopmental delay to prevent long-term negative outcomes?
Mm.
It's a medical intervention for a biological condition.
I want to wrap up with a slightly more philosophical question, if that's okay. We've spent this whole time talking about this maturation delay of, say, 2 to 5 years, and we also know that the human brain continues to develop and change well into the 30s.
Absolutely. The idea that the brain is finished at age 25 is also a bit of a myth. The prefrontal cortex especially keeps refining itself.
So, if ADHD is largely a developmental delay, what does that actually mean for adult ADHD? If I'm 35 and I still have all these struggles, am I still delayed? Or is this just who I am now permanently?
This is the provocative thought I really want to leave you with.
Yeah.
Let's imagine you have a brain that is consistently on a slower timeline. Let's say it's on a 5-year delay compared to the average. Now, what does our society demand? It demands that you choose a career, probably get a degree, pay a mortgage, manage a household, maybe start a family, all starting around age 22.
Right when you leave college.
If your brain is biologically 17 at that point, you're being set up to crash. You're being asked to do things your hardware is not yet built for.
And what happens over the next decade?
You struggle. Maybe you fail. You internalize that failure. You develop anxiety, depression, a deep sense of self-loathing because you can't seem to do what everyone else finds easy. Now, what if that brain does eventually arrive at its mature state, maybe at age 30 or 35? By that point, has the secondary damage already been done?
So the disorder isn't necessarily the brain's timeline itself. It's the profound mismatch between the brain's biological timeline and society's rigid, unforgiving timeline.
Exactly. Is ADHD a permanent, lifelong pathology? Or is it a developmental difference that becomes a disorder because our world has no patience for it? If we built a society that allowed people to develop at their own pace, if we didn't force the Ferrari with bicycle brakes to race in the Daytona 500 at age 20, would it even be a disorder or just a different way of being?
That puts a lot of the responsibility back on us, on society, to change the environment and not just focus on changing the brain.
It does. It means we need to respect the hardware. If you know you have a brain with a sleepy cerebellum and a delayed prefrontal cortex, maybe don't try to be an air traffic controller. Design a life, a career, a routine that works with your specific machine, not against it.
And maybe give yourself some grace for all those years when the brakes hadn't been built yet.
Amen to that. A whole lot of grace.
This has been incredibly dense, but so illuminating. We've gone from cortical thinning to network interference all the way to machine learning subtypes.
It's a lot to take in, but I hope the big takeaway for you is simple. It's real. It's biological. And because we understand it better than ever, it's also more manageable than ever.
Thank you so much for breaking all of this down with us.
It was my pleasure.
And thank you to everyone listening. If your brain feels like a broken seesaw today, just remember, it's not a character flaw, it's geometry. We'll see you on the next deep dive.